The factory's air was thick with the smell of oil and iron, the pounding rhythm of machines echoing like the pulse of an unforgiving heart. Men and women hurried about in uniforms, their eyes fixed on tasks, their bodies trained to the tempo of production. In the middle of that metallic symphony stood a man who looked like he had walked in from another world. His jacket was wrinkled, the fabric thin from years of wear. His shoes, once black, had turned the color of dust, soles worn nearly flat. He raised his hands to his face as if trying to shield himself, not from sparks or machinery, but from the piercing gaze of those who surrounded him. He knew what was coming. He had lived long enough to recognize the sound of ridicule before it arrived. And then it came, sharp as a whip across the floor. "You don't belong here. Look at you. Disgusting beggar." The words cut through the hum of machines, and laughter followed from a few corners. The voice belonged to a tall worker, arms thick from years of labor, his smirk as cruel as the insult itself. He stepped forward, jabbing his finger toward the man as if his existence were a crime. The others slowed their movements. Some smirked, eager to see humiliation. Some turned away, uncomfortable but unwilling to speak. The man lowered his hands. His eyes met those of the accuser, steady and calm. He had heard this before. On sidewalks where strangers tossed coins at his feet without looking at his face. In alleys where children pointed at his rags and giggled. In shelters where men fought over scraps and dignity was the first casualty. He had been spat on, ignored, shoved aside. Yet he had survived it all. Survival had carved strength into his bones, fire into his soul. He breathed deeply before speaking, his voice low but clear, each word carrying the weight of truth. A beggar, yes. Disgusting, no. Hunger teaches dignity. Pain teaches truth. One day, you may know both. The factory grew quiet. The laughter dimmed. The accuser's smirk faltered, though he forced a laugh. Truth. Dignity. You. Don't make me laugh. You're a stray, a parasite, waiting for others to feed you. You think you built something. You're nothing. The man smiled faintly, a sadness hiding in the corners of his lips. In truth, he had built everything. Not with his hands here on the line, but with vision, with sacrifice, with silent years that no one in this room could imagine. He owned this factory. He owned more than this factory. He had walked in disguise, choosing rags over suits, silence over recognition, because only then could he see people for who they truly were. And now, exposed to insult, he saw clearly the cruelty that money could never hide. "If you've never starved," he said, his voice firmer now, "you can't understand the hunger to rise. If you've never frozen, you can't understand the fire that keeps you alive. If you've never been broken, you'll never understand the strength it takes to stand again." His words carried farther than shouts ever could. A hush settled. Even the machines seemed muted, their rhythm background to something heavier. The accuser scoffed, but it lacked conviction. He wanted the crowd with him, but their eyes were no longer his. They were drawn to the man who stood in rags yet spoke with the power of survival. "I see rags," the accuser muttered, "I see weakness." The man shook his head gently. "You see history. You see proof. These clothes tell you where I came from, not where I stand. They remind me never to look down on someone because the world already did that for me." A young worker spoke from the back, voice shaky but honest. "He's right. Being poor doesn't make you worthless. I wore the same shoes for years. People laughed. But I worked. I pushed through. It only made me fight harder." His confession shifted the air. Heads turned. Some workers nodded. Others lowered their gaze, ashamed of their silence moments earlier. The accuser's face burned red, his authority slipping away. The so-called beggar turned toward the young man, gratitude softening his features. "Thank you," he said simply, before turning back to the crowd. "This factory, these machines, this progress, it isn't built by one man. It's built by all of us. But worth isn't measured in coins or cloth. It's measured in whether we lift another when they fall." Silence stretched across the room. The weight of his words pressed heavier than the iron beams above. The accuser shifted, looking for support, but found none. His finger lowered, his sneer dissolved. The man's eyes glistened faintly, not with weakness, but with memory. He remembered the nights when concrete was his mattress, when hunger clawed at him until he nearly surrendered to darkness. He remembered strangers who mocked and strangers who helped, each shaping the man he became. And though he stood in rags now, his truth towered over the room. "I was invisible once," he said, voice steady. "I was nothing. But I rose. And no insult can take that from me." The man's words lingered in the silence, vibrating in the air like a note struck too deeply to be ignored. The workers shifted, uncertain, their eyes moving between the accuser whose authority had just cracked and the stranger who had carried insult as if it were a crown. For years these workers had toiled under the weight of schedules and supervisors, never questioning the rules of dignity that seemed to favor some while crushing others. Now someone had voiced the truth they had buried inside themselves, the truth that being overlooked did not mean being without worth. The man turned slightly, his gaze sweeping over the assembly line. Cars glistened half-finished, their shells like mirrors reflecting the faces of those who built them. He saw their tired eyes, their hardened hands, their quiet sacrifices. He had lived their struggle once. He had stood in endless lines waiting for day labor, hoping for a wage that would buy bread, only to return with nothing but hunger in his stomach and shame in his chest. He remembered those nights as clearly as the machines that roared before him now. His chest rose with a steady breath as he spoke again, not loud, but with a gravity that forced everyone to listen. "When I had nothing, I begged for scraps, not because I lacked strength, but because the world gave me no choice. And even then, people spat, people mocked. Yet here I am, still standing. Do you think your laughter can break me when starvation could not?" His words carved into the silence like chisels into stone. The accuser clenched his fists but said nothing, because his own laughter had already died. Around them, the workers began to see not rags, but resilience. One woman near the assembly line stepped forward slightly, her hands trembling as she spoke. "My father lost everything in the crash years ago. People treated him like trash, even though he once fed them. He died believing he was worthless. But he wasn't. No one who struggles is worthless." Her eyes brimmed with tears, and she quickly turned away, ashamed of her emotion, but her words had already taken root. The man nodded slowly, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "Worth is not given by others. It is lived. It is fought for. Sometimes it is hidden under dirt and pain, but it is never gone." He paused, then looked back at the accuser. "You judged me by my clothes, by my face, by your narrow eyes. But look closer. What you call a beggar, I call a survivor. What you call disgusting, I call proof that I endured what would have destroyed you." The accuser opened his mouth, but no words came. Pride held him there, but it was pride with cracks now, pride bleeding into shame. He looked around for allies, but none came. The workers who once smirked with him now stared in silence, their loyalty shifting. The so-called beggar straightened his shoulders. His voice grew firmer. rising with the rhythm of memory. I was thrown out of restaurants, chased from stores, left to sleep in the rain. I was beaten by strangers for daring to exist where they walked. I was told again and again that I was nothing. And yet I endured. If that makes me a beggar in your eyes, then I am proud to be one. For a beggar who survives carries more strength than a man who mocks. The words struck like lightning, illuminating corners of hearts that had long stayed dark. Some workers felt shame for their silence, others inspiration for their own hidden battles. The accuser's lips trembled, his fists loosening. He had nothing left to throw. The man looked out across the floor, and his eyes grew distant, as if seeing beyond the factory walls. He remembered nights when he stared at the city skyline from beneath a bridge, wondering if light was meant for others, never for him. He remembered the cold that made his bones ache, the hunger that hollowed him, the loneliness that whispered lies in his ear. But he also remembered the tiny acts that had kept him alive. A sandwich pressed into his hands by a stranger who never asked his name. A blanket shared by a fellow wanderer who disappeared the next day. A child who once smiled at him instead of turning away. These were the sparks that had lit his fire. And that fire had grown, feeding on suffering until it became resilience, feeding on cruelty until it became vision. That vision had led him here, into the halls of power disguised as weakness, because only in disguise could he see the truth of others. He breathed deeply, anchoring himself in the present, and then his gaze returned to the accuser. You think power comes from mocking. But true power comes from rising. And I have risen higher than you can imagine. The workers did not yet know the full truth, that he owned not only the machines but the future they were building. He would reveal it in time. For now, he chose to let the lesson speak louder than the revelation. The accuser stepped back, his chest heaving, his voice failing him. The silence of the crowd was louder than any insult. The so-called beggar lowered his gaze briefly, his heart heavy with memory, but when he lifted it again, his eyes shone not with defeat but with defiance, the kind of defiance that could not be broken by laughter, or poverty, or even despair. He had lived as nothing. He had become everything. The silence on the factory floor was no longer the silence of indifference but the silence of awakening. The workers had seen many arguments in this place, heard many shouts between men desperate to prove themselves, but this moment was different. Something about the stranger's voice carried deeper than authority, deeper than fear. It carried truth, and truth was something they had been starved of for years. The accuser, once so bold, now stood with his arms stiff at his sides, his smirk wiped away, his chest rising and falling like a man cornered by his own shadow. The stranger, the so-called beggar, kept his posture calm, his words steady. He did not need to raise his voice to be heard. He had learned long ago that true strength was not in volume but in the weight of what was spoken. I lived invisible for years, he said, and in that invisibility I discovered something most men never see. When the world turns its face from you, when no one calls your name, you learn who you truly are. I discovered I could not be broken by hunger, nor silenced by shame. I discovered that when I had nothing, I still had myself, and that was enough to begin again. The workers listened with rapt attention. Some saw pieces of their own lives reflected in his words, the rent unpaid, the meals skipped, the humiliations endured quietly in order to survive. They felt seen in a way they had not expected in this place of steel and noise. One older worker, his hair streaked with gray, lifted his head and muttered, "He speaks like he's lived 1,000 lives." The stranger's eyes softened. I have lived many lives. I was the child who went to school hungry. I was the boy who walked miles barefoot because shoes were a luxury. I was the man who knocked on doors begging for work and was turned away. Each life carved me, each life built me. And now I stand here, not as a shame to hide, but as proof that no man should be judged by the lowest chapter of his story. His words struck deeper than commands ever could. The young worker who had spoken earlier felt his chest tighten with pride, as if the stranger's strength gave him his own. Even the woman who had shared her father's tragedy wiped at her tears with her sleeve, standing taller than before. The accuser tried to laugh again, but it was hollow, the sound of pride without ground. He wanted to say the stranger was lying, that he was nothing more than he appeared, but the words would not come. His certainty had been shattered. The stranger turned, letting his gaze sweep across the workers. Do not be fooled into thinking dignity is given by wealth, he continued. Dignity is earned in the silence of your battles, in the nights no one sees you fight. I stand before you not to ask for your respect, but to remind you of your own. Because every one of you, whether rich or poor, carries storms inside that others will never know. And it is how you rise from those storms that defines you. The factory, usually a place of cold efficiency, felt suddenly human. The workers looked at one another differently now. For a moment, they were not just laborers but survivors, fighters in their own quiet wars. The stranger let the silence breathe, his eyes turning inward. He remembered again the nights of hunger so sharp it felt like knives in his belly, the mornings when his body begged him not to rise. He remembered begging on street corners, each coin tossed into his hand both a mercy and a wound. He remembered the faces that turned away, the eyes that looked through him as if he were already dead. And then he remembered the single smile of a child, the hand of an old man who once whispered, "Don't give up." Those fragments had kept him alive. They had built a foundation stronger than stone, a foundation now hidden beneath the rags they mocked. He inhaled slowly, then spoke again. You see a beggar. I see a man who survived the fire. You see rags. I see armor forged in suffering. You see nothing. I see everything I had to become. The words rippled across the room like waves crashing against shore. No one laughed now. Even the accuser stood silent, his arrogance stripped bare. And though the stranger revealed nothing of his true identity, the seeds were planted. Seeds of doubt in cruelty, seeds of pride in survival, seeds that would one day bloom into a truth too powerful to deny. The factory's walls seemed to close in with the weight of silence, the kind that comes when truth strips away the illusions men hide behind. The stranger's voice had touched corners of the heart that most of these workers had sealed long ago. Some of them lowered their eyes, ashamed of how easily they had laughed at the insult thrown earlier, ashamed of how often they too had mocked others to hide their own pain. The accuser stood frozen, his pride bleeding out of him in the stillness. He wanted to fight back, to reclaim the control he once had, but his words had dried up like a well in summer. The stranger, still calm, still carrying the quiet power of endurance, did not press forward with anger. He did not need to. His very presence was a living testament to battles already won. When I was younger, he began again, his voice low but steady, I believed the world was a place of fairness. I believed if you worked hard, if you were honest, if you gave everything you had, the world would give back. But it didn't. I worked until my body broke, and still I slept on the streets. I gave kindness to strangers, and they answered with cruelty. I begged for bread, and they answered with laughter. His words were not accusations, they were confessions. And confessions carry a power no command ever can. The workers listened, some with tears in their eyes, some with fists clenched at the injustice of it all. He continued, but those years, those dark nights, They taught me something no school, no book, no fortune ever could. They taught me resilience. They taught me that dignity is not something the world gives, it is something you carry even when the world spits on you. He lifted his head higher, his eyes burning with a fire that seemed both ancient and unyielding. I survived. I rose. And every insult became a brick in the foundation I built beneath me. Every rejection became the wind that pushed me forward. Every cruel laugh became the spark that kept my fire alive. The factory floor was no longer a place of labor, it was a courtroom of the soul, and every man and woman there was the jury. And they were not siding with the accuser. They were siding with the truth that poured from the man they had mocked as a beggar. The accuser's chest heaved. He wanted to strike back, to claw at the stranger's strength, but in his silence he revealed more weakness than any insult could hide. One worker, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, finally spoke. "We laughed at you because it was easy. But it wasn't right. I see it now. You've lived more than most of us ever will." His words broke the dam. Another worker added, "I used to think being poor was shameful. But now I see shame only belongs to those who mock the poor." A murmur of agreement swept across the room. For the first time, the accuser felt the isolation of standing alone. His authority, once solid as steel, crumbled like dust. The stranger let the murmurs flow, then raised his hand slightly, and silence returned. "Do not hate him for what he said," he told them, his voice softer now. "Hate only keeps us chained. Understand him. For men who mock the broken are often broken themselves, though they hide it with laughter." His mercy startled them. He had every right to humiliate his accuser, to strike him with the same cruelty he had been given, yet he chose grace. That grace spoke louder than vengeance ever could. He looked again at the accuser. "I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I refuse to carry your hatred in my soul. Forgiveness is freedom, and I have fought too hard to lose mine now." The accuser's face crumpled, not in anger but in shame. He lowered his head, his voice caught in his throat. The workers watched in silence, some in awe, some in tears, as the so-called beggar transformed before their eyes from a man mocked to a man revered. In that moment, the rags no longer looked like rags. They looked like robes of survival, stitched with the thread of resilience. The man who had been insulted stood tall, not because of wealth revealed, not because of power declared, but because truth had crowned him king of the moment. The air in the factory had changed completely. What began as ridicule had become revelation. What began as a spectacle had become a lesson etched into the hearts of every man and woman present. The workers no longer saw a beggar in rags. They saw a man who carried storms inside him and still stood tall. Some felt pride, some felt guilt, some felt hope. But all of them felt something stir that had long been buried beneath years of labor and silence. The stranger's eyes wandered across their faces. He saw in them the same hunger he once carried, the same fatigue etched into their bones. He knew what it meant to work without reward, to live without recognition. He spoke again, each word deliberate, heavy with the weight of memory. "When I begged on the streets, I thought I had lost everything. But I hadn't. I had my breath. I had my will. And as long as I had those, I had a chance. A chance to rise, a chance to rebuild, a chance to prove that life does not end where suffering begins." His words wrapped around the crowd like a cloak. The woman who had spoken earlier about her father's despair pressed her hand to her mouth, tears sliding freely now, not out of sorrow alone but out of recognition that dignity could survive even when everything else was stripped away. The stranger's gaze softened as he continued. "Some of you carry pain quietly. I can see it in your eyes. You go home and wonder how to feed your children. You wake in the night afraid of losing your jobs. You swallow your pride to endure insults because you think silence is the price of survival. I know this because I lived it. And I am telling you, silence is not weakness. Endurance is not shame. Survival is not failure. Every day you rise again, you prove you are stronger than the world that tried to break you. His words felt like fire and water at once, burning away shame, washing away despair. Even the machines seemed quieter, as if the steel itself bent to listen. The accuser, standing apart, looked smaller now, as though his body could not carry the weight of the shame pressing down on him. His arrogance had been stripped bare, and what remained was the fragile core of a man who realized too late that cruelty is a mirror that reflects only weakness. The stranger stepped closer to him, not with threat but with calm. Do you know why your insult doesn't wound me? Because I have lived wounds far deeper. You call me a beggar as if it is the worst thing a man can be. But I have been hungry and still given my last crust of bread to another. I have been homeless and still shared my blanket with a stranger. If being a beggar means carrying humanity even when I had nothing, then I wear that name with pride. His voice grew stronger now, no longer soft but rising like a tide. But understand this, what you call a beggar once built the strength to rise, and that strength has carried me farther than your laughter ever could. I am no man's shame. I am proof that dignity cannot be destroyed. The workers exhaled as though they had been holding their breath. Something invisible but immense had shifted. For the first time, they felt that the factory, so often a place of exhaustion and command, had become a place of truth. The stranger looked at them all, his eyes shining with memory and vision. Never measure a man by what you see in a single moment. For every man carries chapters you have not read. You looked at me and thought you saw nothing. But what you saw was the cover of a story still being written. His words lingered like a promise. And though he had not yet revealed who he truly was, the seeds of transformation had been planted deeply in the hearts around him. The beggar who was not a beggar had begun to rise, not with wealth flaunted, but with truth unveiled. The crowd of workers stood in silence, yet the silence was not empty. It was charged with emotion, thick with the weight of every memory the stranger's words had stirred inside them. Some thought of their own childhoods, of nights when hunger gnawed louder than sleep, of mornings when they wore shoes so worn they cut into their skin. Others thought of insults they had swallowed at the hands of men who believed wealth gave them the right to trample dignity. Now, watching the man before them, they felt a strange kind of pride rising in their chests, as if his resilience was their own. The stranger's voice did not falter, for his strength was not in his volume but in the truth he had lived. I once believed suffering made me less, he said slowly, but I learned that suffering was the forge where my strength was made. I was cast out, forgotten, laughed at. I slept beneath bridges while men like you passed by, pretending I did not exist. But I endured, and endurance became my wealth. Endurance became my crown. The accuser swallowed hard. His fists hung limp at his sides, his earlier bravado vanished like smoke. He looked at the man not with scorn now, but with the first flicker of fear, the fear that comes when one realizes he has stood on the wrong side of truth. The worker's eyes followed every word, every gesture. Their world had been narrowed for years to paychecks and deadlines, but suddenly it widened, cracked open by the reminder that dignity could not be bought, nor measured in uniforms or wages. The stranger took a step closer to them, his presence pulling them in like a flame draws the cold. You think a man's worth is in what he wears, or what he owns, he continued. But let me tell you, worth lives in the heart that still beats after being broken 1,000 times. Worth is in the hand that lifts another even when it trembles. Worth is in the soul that refuses to give up when the world calls him nothing. His eyes moved across them all, pausing at faces lined with fatigue. Do you not see? Every one of you has worth that no insult can erase. The young worker who had spoken earlier felt tears sting his eyes, not from weakness, but from the fierce pride that surged through him. He whispered to himself, "He's right. He's so right." A murmur rose from the crowd, not of laughter this time, but of agreement, quiet and powerful. The accuser shifted again, his face pale, his voice trapped in his throat. For the first time he looked like the smaller man, the weaker man, though his uniform was crisp and his shoes polished. The stranger's eyes lingered on him with something close to pity. "You see, I do not hate you," he said softly. "I pity you, for the man who mocks the broken reveals only his own emptiness. You called me a beggar, but I tell you this, I am rich beyond your understanding. Not because of coins, but because of strength. Not because of possessions, but because of the fire that could not be put out." The words struck like hammers against stone. The workers stood straighter, their chests rising with something they had not felt in years, dignity reborn. The factory floor, once a place of endless repetition, now felt like sacred ground, as though truth had sanctified it. The stranger closed his eyes briefly, and memories washed over him again. The rain soaking through his rags as he shivered in alleys, the rejection in the eyes of those who turned him away, the crushing weight of hunger that made him question his own worth. But in those memories also shone the moments that saved him. The sandwich given in silence, the blanket shared in kindness, the fleeting smile that told him he was not invisible. He opened his eyes, fire glowing within them. "Those small kindnesses," he said, "were worth more than gold. They reminded me that even in the darkest places, light exists. And it is that light I carried with me into every battle. That is why I stand here today." His voice rose, and the factory seemed to tremble with him. "So call me beggar if you wish. But understand this. I am not defined by what I was. I am defined by what I became. And what I became cannot be broken." The words poured over them like a tide, and no one could resist. The workers' hearts pounded, their eyes shone, and even those who once laughed now bowed their heads. In that moment, the man who had been insulted stood not as a beggar, not even as a stranger, but as a mirror showing them their own hidden strength. The factory floor felt different now, as though the air itself had shifted, thick with something unspoken but deeply understood. The workers, who had come in that morning expecting another ordinary day of labor, found themselves standing in the middle of a moment that would remain carved in their memory forever. They stared at the man in rags with a mixture of awe and reverence, as if the story of his life was somehow their story too. He had not shouted, he had not threatened, he had not raised a hand, and yet he had broken the walls of pride and prejudice with nothing more than truth. His eyes swept across the faces gathered before him. "Do not let the world tell you that you are nothing," he said, his voice steady, his tone almost tender now. "The world will try to measure you by coins, by clothes, by titles. But those measures are lies. I stand here in rags and yet I am richer than most men in suits, for I carry within me the strength to rise again and again. That is wealth no thief can steal, no insult can stain." A murmur of agreement rose, some nodding, others pressing their lips together to hold back emotion. The young worker wiped at his face, his pride no longer hidden. The woman who had spoken of her father placed her hand over her heart as though steadying it. The older man with gray hair muttered softly, "It feels like he is speaking to my soul." The accuser stood apart, his body heavy with the weight of shame. His earlier laughter now seemed childish, a shallow echo that mocked only himself. He had thought himself strong, but strength had been revealed not in him but in the one he mocked. The stranger stepped closer, his words directed at everyone but his gaze resting on the man who had insulted him. "I forgive the laughter. I forgive the scorn, not because I am weak, but because I refuse to chain myself to your hatred. Forgiveness is not a gift to you, it is freedom for me." The accuser's lips trembled, his head lowering, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of his pride finally broke. He could not meet the stranger's eyes. Around them, the workers witnessed something greater than victory. They witnessed grace. The stranger turned back to the crowd. "I lived as nothing once, and I know how it feels to be unseen. That is why I walk among you now, not to be above you, but to remind you that none of you are unseen. Every calloused hand, every tired back, every silent sacrifice matters. You are not machines. You are men and women with dignity. And never let anyone take that from you." His words rippled through them, seeping into their bones like warmth on a winter morning. For the first time in years, some felt hope not in promises of pay, not in the distant dreams of wealth, but in the recognition of their worth. The stranger paused, breathing deeply, memories swirling again, memories of nights when he nearly gave up, when the cold begged him to surrender, when hunger whispered lies that he was worthless. But he had risen, again and again, until resilience itself became his identity. He opened his eyes and spoke once more. "You may see me as a beggar. But know this, I am not ashamed. For the beggar who survives is stronger than the man who mocks. And I have survived, I have risen, and nothing you say can take that away." The factory fell into a silence so profound it felt sacred. The workers stood taller, the accuser stood smaller, and the stranger in rags stood as proof that dignity, once claimed, could never be taken. The weight of his words settled into the hearts of everyone standing there, and it felt as though time itself had slowed. The machines kept working, sparks still flying, metal still bending, but none of the workers truly heard it anymore. Their ears were tuned only to the voice of the man who had once been dismissed as a beggar. His presence had shifted from that of a stranger in rags to something much larger, something undeniable. He was no longer simply a man defending himself. He was the embodiment of every struggle they had endured and every quiet strength they had carried. He drew in a long breath, his eyes distant as though staring not at the walls of the factory but at the chapters of his past. "Do you know what it means to sleep with nothing but the cold for a blanket?" he asked softly. "Do you know what it means to walk through streets where every face looks past you, where every door is shut before you can even knock? I lived there. I lived in the shadows of this world, where men are treated as ghosts before they are even dead." His voice trembled slightly, not from weakness but from the gravity of memory. "And yet, in that darkness, I learned something. I learned that I was still alive. I learned that as long as I could draw breath, I could fight. And as long as I could fight, I could rise." The workers listened, many with their eyes burning, their chests heavy. They thought of their own private wars, the sacrifices no one ever saw, the nights they lay awake wondering if they were invisible to the world. His words reached those places no command, no paycheck ever could. The accuser stood frozen, staring at the floor, unable to meet the gaze of the man he had mocked. His earlier bravado had shattered completely. He was no longer the voice of power but the echo of regret. The stranger's voice grew stronger, rising like a tide that could not be held back. You thought I was nothing. You thought your insult would bury me. But I am proof that nothing can become everything. I was mocked. I was rejected. I was left to starve. And still I rose. Every scar you would use to shame me, I wear as a crown. For they remind me that I survived what would have destroyed most men. His words rang out across the steel and sparks, shaking the very walls of the place. A murmur of agreement rose from the workers, not timid now but strong, united. Some began to clap softly, the sound growing, echoing like a heartbeat of defiance against cruelty. The accuser's face burned, shame carving deeper than any insult ever could. The stranger raised his hand gently, and the clapping subsided. I do not need applause, he said, his tone calm again. What I need is for you to see yourselves. See that worth is not in what hangs on your back but in the fire that burns in your chest. You are more than laborers. You are more than the labels others throw at you. You are human, and that alone makes you priceless. The factory, once only a place of work, felt like a sanctuary now, a place where truth had been spoken so plainly that it could never be silenced again. For the first time in a long time, the workers felt seen. Truly seen. And in the center of it all, the man in rags stood not as a victim, not even as a beggar, but as a living testament that dignity, once claimed, could light even the darkest halls. The silence that followed felt like it stretched forever, yet it was filled with something powerful, something raw. The workers stood with their shoulders straighter, as though the stranger's strength had entered into them. Their eyes no longer saw a man in torn clothes, no longer saw the marks of poverty that had once made them avert their gaze. They saw instead a man who had endured the fire and emerged unburned, a man who carried scars not as wounds but as proof. The stranger looked around at them, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and pride. You think I am here by accident, he said softly. But I came here to see the truth. To see how men treat those they believe are beneath them. And today, I have seen both cruelty and kindness. The cruelty of laughter, and the kindness of those who dared to see more than rags. His words hung in the air, and many of the workers bowed their heads, ashamed of how easily they had followed the laughter. The young worker who had spoken earlier clenched his fists, not in anger but in determination. He knew now that silence in the face of cruelty was its own kind of betrayal. The stranger's gaze turned inward again, his memories pouring through him. I remember when I stood outside restaurants watching men eat, my stomach empty, my body trembling. I remember when I knocked on doors only to be shoved away. I remember when the rain soaked through my rags until I thought I would never feel warmth again. And I remember every face that looked at me as though I were not a man but a shadow. His eyes glistened, though his voice did not break. Those moments shaped me. They carved me into who I am. I do not hate them now. I thank them. For every cruelty became the stone I stepped on to climb higher. Every insult became the wind that carried me forward. Every rejection became the lesson that taught me strength. The workers listened in silence, their hearts pounding. They realized that this man, mocked as a beggar, carried within him more wealth than all the coins in their supervisors' pockets. Wealth of resilience, wealth of truth, wealth of humanity. The accuser could no longer lift his head. His shame was complete, his pride broken. He had tried to make another man small, but in doing so, he had only made himself smaller. The stranger stepped closer, his voice firm now, his presence unshakable. Do not call me nothing. For I am everything your cruelty could not destroy. I am the proof that a man's worth is not decided by another's judgment. I am the fire that hunger could not put out. I am the dignity that mockery could not steal. And I am here to remind you all that no man, no woman, no child is ever truly nothing. His words filled the space like thunder, and though no storm raged outside, the workers felt as though lightning had struck inside their souls. Some nodded, some wept quietly, some simply stood frozen as though afraid the moment might pass too quickly. In the center of the factory, amid the machines and sparks, the man in rags no longer seemed like a beggar. He seemed like the very embodiment of survival, of truth, of a dignity that refused to bow. The workers could feel their own breathing as though the entire factory had drawn one collective breath and held it, waiting for what might come next. The stranger's presence no longer felt like an interruption in their day. It felt like the very reason they had all gathered, as if fate had paused time so that each of them might learn what it meant to be truly human. His eyes scanned the room again, resting briefly on each face, his voice deep but calm. "Do you see it now?" he asked, and the question seemed directed not only at the accuser but at everyone present. "Do you see that a man's worth cannot be erased by poverty, cannot be mocked away by laughter, cannot be stolen by cruelty? Worth lives inside, and it rises when the world tries to bury it." The woman who had spoken of her father whispered through her tears, "Yes, we see it." The young worker nodded fiercely, his voice stronger now. "We see you, and we see ourselves in you." The stranger inclined his head slightly, acknowledging their words, though his gaze remained firm. "I walked among you not to take from you, but to remind you of what you already carry. I wore rags not because I had nothing else, but because I wanted to know if men could see past them. Some did, some did not, and that is the truth of this world." His confession startled them. The workers exchanged glances, realization dawning slowly that the man before them was more than he appeared. The accuser lifted his head slightly, confusion flickering through his shame. The stranger stepped closer to him, his words cutting yet compassionate. "You judged me because you thought I was beneath you. But tell me, if a man in rags can stand unbroken while you crumble in shame, who is truly rich and who is truly poor?" The accuser's mouth opened, but no words came. His silence was his answer, and it echoed louder than any defense. The stranger turned back to the crowd. "I have been called nothing my entire life. But I stand before you today as proof that nothing can become everything. Every man here, every woman here, carries stories unseen, scars hidden, battles fought in silence. Do not let anyone's laughter erase the truth. For survival itself is victory, and endurance itself is greatness." The factory floor trembled with the weight of his words. Some workers wiped their faces, others clenched their fists with renewed pride, others simply stood still, knowing they were part of something that would be told and retold long after the machines stopped that day. The stranger's voice softened now, though it carried even further. "Call me beggar if you wish. But know this, I am the beggar who endured the storm, the beggar who carried fire in his bones, the beggar who rose when the world pushed him down. And if that is shame, then I will carry it proudly until my last breath." His chest rose as he drew in a deep breath, and the silence that followed felt holy, as though the entire place had transformed from a factory into a temple where truth had been spoken without fear. The factory floor had become a place unlike any other. Where once there had been only noise, routine, and the hum of machines, now there was silence filled with meaning, with weight, with truth. The workers stood like witnesses to something far greater than their daily labor, their hearts carrying a fire that had been lit by the stranger who had walked among them in rags. His presence no longer felt like intrusion, it felt like destiny. He drew in one last deep breath, his chest rising with the memory of every scar, every hunger, every cold night that had shaped him. I was broken, he said, his voice steady, but being broken taught me how to rise. I was mocked, but mockery taught me how to endure. I was invisible, but invisibility taught me how to see. And now I stand before you to say this. Dignity cannot be given, it cannot be bought, it cannot be taken. It can only be lived. The accuser, who had once laughed so loudly, now stood with his head bowed, unable to meet the eyes of the man he had ridiculed. Shame weighed on him heavier than chains. He realized too late that his laughter had revealed more about his own emptiness than about the stranger's worth. The workers no longer looked at him for direction, they looked at the man they had called a beggar. And in that moment, the factory floor no longer belonged to steel and sparks, it belonged to truth. The stranger's eyes softened as he looked at them all, his voice lowering into something almost like prayer. Remember this day. Remember that worth is not measured in the coins you earn but in the storms you survive. Remember that no insult can erase your humanity. Remember that every time you rise after being broken, you are proving the world wrong. The young worker stepped forward, his face wet with tears but his voice firm. We will remember. You showed us who we are. The woman who had spoken of her father whispered through trembling lips, you showed me that he was never worthless. The older man with gray hair nodded slowly, his voice deep with conviction. You reminded me that survival is its own kind of greatness. The stranger smiled faintly, sadness and pride mingled in his expression. You do not need me to tell you who you are. You already know. You only needed someone to remind you. His eyes lifted, and for a moment they seemed to look far beyond the factory walls, to the nights of rain, the alleys of hunger, the bridges where he had slept, the faces of strangers who had given him crumbs of kindness. Those memories would never leave him, nor did he want them to. They were the proof of who he had been and who he had become. He turned back to the workers one last time. I came here to see if humanity still lives among men. And today, I have seen it. Do not lose it. Do not let cruelty steal it from you. For kindness is the only true wealth we carry from this life. The words fell into their hearts like seeds into fertile ground, and though they stood in a place of metal and oil, it felt like holy soil beneath their feet. Slowly, without command, the workers began to clap, not for a boss, not for a leader, but for a man who had carried the name Beggar and transformed it into a crown. The sound grew, echoing against the steel beams, rolling like thunder across the vast space. The accuser did not clap. His head remained bowed, his shame complete. But even he felt the truth in his bones. The stranger stood still, his eyes glistening, and for the first time in years, he felt the burden of his scars lighten. Not because the pain had vanished, but because it had finally found purpose. He nodded once, quietly, and then turned toward the exit. The workers parted for him without a word, not because he commanded them, but because respect had been carved into their souls. As he walked out of the factory into the light of day, the sun touched his face, warm and golden. He breathed in the air deeply, as though tasting freedom again, and whispered to himself, I was nothing, and I became everything. Behind him, the factory returned to its rhythm, but it was no longer the same. For every man and woman who had witnessed that day carried something new inside them. They carried the reminder that no insult could define them, no cruelty could erase them, and no poverty could strip them of their worth. And in that truth, they felt stronger than they ever had before.